She grabbed his tie before he could even say hello. Not to greet him, not to flirt. She yanked it straight right there in front of 200 wedding guests, like she owned him already. Caleb Rhodes. Navy veteran, single father, a man who hadn't let a stranger touch him in 6 years, didn't move, didn't breathe. Because the woman fixing his collar was Isabella Vance, the coldest CEO in the tech industry. And she was trembling. If you're watching this from Texas, Ohio, California, or anywhere else in America tonight, drop your city in the comments so I know how far this story has traveled. Subscribe now, because what happens next on that ocean balcony will change how you think about second chances. Let's begin. The tie was crooked. That was the only reason she touched him. At least that's what Isabella Vance told herself in the half-second before her fingers closed around the silk. Caleb Rhodes hadn't noticed. He was too busy scanning the room the way he scanned every room, now exits. First threats, second people last. 6 years in the Navy had trained that instinct into his spine, and 4 years of raising a daughter alone had never given him a reason to unlearn it. He stood near a marble pillar at the edge of the reception hall, a glass of untouched champagne sweating in his hand, watching 200 strangers laugh at jokes he hadn't heard. "You're going to break that glass if you keep holding it like it owes you money," said a voice beside him. Caleb turned, and that was when it happened. Isabella Vance. A woman he had clocked the moment she walked in. The way you clock a storm system on the horizon, was standing close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something clean and expensive, like rain on stone. "Excuse me, your collar," she said, and before he could step back, her hand was already at his throat, straightening the fabric with 2 brisk, efficient movements. "Someone did this for you in a hurry. A child, maybe." "My daughter," Caleb said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "She likes helping me get dressed. She's not very good at it yet. She's better than you'd think." Isabella's fingers lingered half a second too long against the collar's edge before she pulled them back like she'd touched something hot. "There. Now you look like you belong here, instead of like you're guarding the exit." "I am guarding the exit," Caleb said. Force of habit. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not amusement exactly, but close to it. A woman who ran board meetings the way generals ran wars didn't usually get caught off guard by a stranger's honesty. She recovered fast. "Isabella Vance," she said, extending a hand. "I know who you are," Caleb said, taking it. Her grip was firm, deliberate, like everything else about her. "Caleb Rhodes." "You're not on my radar, Mr. Rhodes, and I make it a point to know everyone in a room. I'm not important enough to be on anyone's radar. I'm just here because Danny Osorio served with me. 2 tours. He said I owed him a wedding." "Owed him?" "He pulled me out of a building that was on fire. Least I could do was rent a suit." Isabella studied him for a long moment, the way she studied quarterly earnings reports looking for the number that didn't add up. "That's not a small debt to repay with a suit." "No," Caleb agreed. "But it's the only currency I've got left." She didn't ask what he meant by left. She didn't need to. There was a particular quality to grief that Isabella Vance had learned to recognize from 30 feet away, long before she'd ever gotten close enough to smell someone's cologne. It sat behind the eyes. It changed the way a man held his shoulders, like he was carrying something invisible that never got lighter. "Well, Mr. Rhodes," she said, stepping back, restoring the professional distance she'd apparently forgotten she'd abandoned. "Enjoy the reception. Try not to guard the exit too aggressively. The cake is excellent, and nobody's coming to rob it." She walked away before he could respond, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm too precise to be careless. Caleb watched her go, and for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, he found himself wanting a woman to turn around and look back at him. She didn't, but 3 tables over, when she thought no one was watching, she did glance back just once, just long enough to see that he was still standing there, still watching her. A small and startled kind of confusion written across his face, like he wasn't sure what had just happened to him either. Danny found him 20 minutes later, 2 beers in hand, grinning like he'd just won a bet with himself. "I saw that," Danny said, handing Caleb a bottle. Saw what? Isabella Vance touched your collar in front of half the tech industry's most important people, and you didn't flinch. Do you have any idea what that woman is worth? I don't care what she's worth. 400 million, Caleb. She built Vance Dynamics from a garage to a Fortune 500 company by the time she was 32. She fired her own father from the board when he tried to undercut a merger. People call her the Glacier. You know why? Let me guess. Cold. Cold and unmovable. Nobody gets close to that woman. Nobody. Danny took a long pull from his beer, watching Caleb's face carefully. And she just fixed your tie in front of the wedding photographer. Caleb glanced across the room. Isabella was standing near the bar, now engaged in a conversation with a man in an expensive suit, her expression perfectly composed, professional. Distant, exactly like someone who hadn't just touched a stranger's collar with something that looked for half a second like tenderness. It didn't mean anything, Caleb said. She probably just has an eye for detail, runs a company, can't stand things being crooked. Sure. Danny said, not believing a word of it. That's exactly what it was. Danny. What? Drop it. Danny raised both hands in mock surrender, but the grin didn't leave his face. All right, I'm just saying, you've been a ghost for 6 years, man. Emily's wedding, Marcus's retirement party, my own engagement dinner. You show up, you stand in the corner, and you leave before dessert. Tonight, you're still here. That's not nothing. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked down at the beer in his hand, at the condensation running down the glass in slow rivulets, and thought about Sarah, the way she used to laugh at weddings, the way she'd always cried a little during the vows, even though she said she wouldn't every single time. I have Mia to think about, he said finally. That's it. That's the whole equation. There isn't room in it for anything else. Mia's for Caleb. She's not going to stay for forever. And you can't keep living like the whole world stopped the day Sarah passed. Watch it, Caleb said low and even, the warning clear in his voice. Danny held his gaze for a second, then let it go, the way old friends learn to let things go when they know pushing further will only cost them something neither of them wants to lose. Okay, sorry. Forget I said anything. They stood in silence for a while, watching the dance floor fill with people who still believed or wanted to believe in the kind of love that lasted. Caleb's eyes drifted without his permission, back to the woman by the bar. She was laughing now at something the man in the suit had said. A practiced laugh controlled the kind that revealed nothing about what she actually felt. But there was a tightness around her eyes. Caleb noticed a fatigue that no amount of professional polish could fully disguise. He recognized that fatigue. He wore it himself most days. Cool. Isabella excused herself from the conversation with Richard Calloway, a venture capitalist who wanted a piece of her next product line and had spent the last 10 minutes trying to disguise that fact behind small talk about sailing, and made her way toward the terrace doors. She needed air. She needed 5 minutes where nobody was trying to extract something from her. The terrace overlooked the Pacific, the water catching the last orange light of the evening before the sun surrendered fully to the horizon. Isabella gripped the stone railing and breathed, actually breathed for what felt like the first time all day. She thought about her calendar. Tomorrow board meeting at 8, investor call at 11, lunch with the legal team about the Henderson litigation, 3 back-to-back product reviews, dinner with her mother, that she would probably cancel because dinner with her mother always left her feeling like she'd failed at something she couldn't name. She thought about the last time someone had touched her without an agenda attached to it. She couldn't remember. That was the truth she didn't say out loud to anyone. Not to her therapist, whom she saw twice a month and lied to regularly, not to her assistant, not to the string of men her mother kept trying to introduce her to at charity galas. Isabella Vance had built an empire out of controlled precision and an almost pathological refusal to need anyone. It had worked. It had made her powerful. It had also made her, she suspected, quietly and thoroughly alone. She thought of Caleb Rhodes's collar under her fingers, the warmth of his skin just beneath the fabric, the way he'd gone completely still, not from fear, but from something that looked disarmingly like surprise, as if being touched gently was a foreign language he'd forgotten how to speak. Stop it, she told herself. You don't know anything about that man. You know he served, you know he lost someone, and you know he has a daughter. That's not a foundation. That's 3 facts and a wedding. But her fingers still remembered the shape of his collarbone. She heard footsteps behind her and straightened automatically, resetting her posture into the version of herself the world expected, composed, unreadable, in charge. "I'm not stalking you," Caleb said, holding up both hands as he stepped onto the terrace. "Danny wanted to introduce me to the caterer for some reason I don't understand, and I escaped. I didn't realize you'd claimed this spot." "I haven't claimed anything. It's a free terrace." "Right." He walked to the railing, leaving several feet of respectful distance between them, and looked out at the water. "It's beautiful out here." "It is." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the reception muffled behind the glass doors, the ocean breathing in slow, rhythmic waves below them. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said. "You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." He turned slightly toward her. "Why'd you fix my collar?" Isabella didn't answer immediately. She watched the water instead, buying herself time the way she'd learned to buy herself time in every negotiation she'd ever walked into. "Because it was crooked," she said finally. "That's not an answer. That's a fact. It's the only one I have." Caleb nodded slowly, accepting the deflection without pushing it, which surprised her more than if he'd pushed. Most people pushed. Most people wanted more from her than she was willing to give, and when she gave them the wall instead, they either got angry or got calculating, trying to find another way in. Caleb Rhodes just nodded and let it be. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Yeah, okay. You don't owe me an explanation for fixing my tie. I was just curious." He looked back out at the water. "It's not every day a stranger touches me like that. Caught me off guard, that's all." "Like what?" He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things carefully, without rushing toward the easy answer. "Gentle," he said finally. "Nobody's touched me gentle in a long time." The honesty of it landed somewhere in Isabella's chest she didn't have a name for. She'd built her entire adult life around never saying things like that out loud, and here was a man who said it without flinching, without performing vulnerability for effect, just stating it as fact, the way she'd stated the collar was crooked. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and she meant it in a way that surprised her. "Don't be. It's not your fault. It's just after my wife died people stopped touching me. Not out of cruelty. Out of fear, I think. Grief makes people nervous. They don't know where the edges of it are, so they keep their distance so they don't accidentally step on something broken." He exhaled long and slow. "My daughter's the only one who still hugs me like she means it. Everyone else shakes my hand like I might shatter." "How long ago?" 4 years. Car accident. She was picking Mia up from daycare." His voice stayed level, but Isabella could hear the effort it took to keep it that way, like watching someone hold a door shut against a wind that never stopped blowing. "I was deployed. I wasn't there. I got the call on a base 3,000 miles away, and by the time I made it home, they'd already had the funeral without me because they thought I wouldn't make it back in time. And Mia needed something to hold on to that day, even if it wasn't me. Caleb." His name came out of her mouth, soft, unpracticed, nothing like the way she said names in boardrooms. "You don't have to tell me this." "I know. I don't usually." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I don't know why I'm telling you. Maybe because you're a stranger. Maybe it's easier to say the true thing to someone who won't be around tomorrow to remind me I said it." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, subtle but undeniable, like a tectonic plate, settling into a slightly different position. She was used to being underestimated by men who thought her power made her fragile in other ways. Used to being approached by men who wanted access to her money, or her name, or her influence. She was not used to a man handing her his grief with no strings attached, expecting nothing in return, not even comfort. "For what it's worth," she said. "I don't think that's weakness. Telling the truth to a stranger. I think most people spend their whole lives performing for people who already know them, and they never say a true thing to anyone." "Is that what you do? Perform?" The question hit closer to the center than she expected. She turned to face him fully now, studying his expression in the fading light, looking for judgment and finding none. "Every day," she admitted. "Every single day. I haven't said an unguarded sentence to another person in years. Not to my board, not to my mother, not to the men my mother tries to set me up with who want to marry Vance Dynamics more than they want to marry me." She paused, surprised at herself at how easily the words were coming. "I don't know why I'm telling you this either. Maybe it's the ocean," Caleb said. "Makes people honest. Or maybe it's just easier to be real with someone who has nothing to gain from you. You'd be surprised how many people think they have something to gain from me. I don't want anything from you, Isabella." He said her name carefully, like he was testing whether he'd earned the right to use it. "I don't want your money. I don't want your company. I don't want to be photographed next to you for some magazine spread. I just wanted to say thank you for fixing my collar. That's it. That's the whole thing." Something in Isabella's chest cracked open just slightly, just enough to let a small current of unfamiliar air through. She wasn't used to wanting nothing being enough. She wasn't used to a man's honesty landing without an agenda folded inside it. "You're welcome," she said. "For the collar." They stood there a moment longer, the space between them charged with something neither of them had a name for, yet something too new and too fragile to be examined directly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, visible only in glimpses, only if you didn't look too hard, too fast. "I should get back inside," Isabella said finally, though she made no move to leave. "Richard Calloway is probably wondering where I disappeared to." "The venture capitalist." "You know him. I know the type. Wants something from you wrapped in small talk about sailing." Isabella actually laughed a real laugh, short and surprised, nothing like the practiced sound she'd used inside with Calloway. "How did you know he talked about sailing?" "Lucky guess. Guys like that always talk about sailing. It's supposed to make them sound relaxed and successful at the same time." "You're more perceptive than you let on, Mr. Rhodes." Occupational hazard. You spend enough years reading rooms for threats, you start reading people for everything else too. She studied him a moment longer, something calculating and curious, moving behind her eyes. The CEO's mind working even now, even here, cataloging information, building a model of who this man was. "Will I see you again?" she asked, and the question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She hadn't planned to ask it. It had simply arrived unbidden, the way honest questions sometimes did when the armor slipped even an inch. Caleb hesitated. Isabella watched the hesitation cross his face and understood it immediately. Not reluctance born of disinterest, but reluctance born of fear. The particular fear of a man who had already lost the thing he loved most, and had spent 4 years building a life, carefully insulated, against ever risking that kind of loss again. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I have a daughter who needs stability more than she needs a father chasing something that might not go anywhere. And you're—" He gestured vaguely at the terrace, the reception hall beyond it. "The entire glittering apparatus of her life. You're all of this. I'm a guy who fixes engines part-time and picks his kid up from preschool at 3:30. Those are different worlds." "They don't have to be," Isabella said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. "Maybe not," Caleb said. "But maybe some worlds are different for a reason." The words hung in the air between them, not quite a rejection, not quite an invitation, occupying that uncertain space where two people who have just met each other stand at the edge of something they both feel and neither is ready to name. "Well," Isabella said, straightening, reassembling herself piece by piece back into the woman who ran boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals. "It was nice meeting you, Caleb Rhodes. Thank you for the honest conversation. It's a rarer commodity than you'd think." "Nice meeting you too, Isabella Vance." She turned to go, her hand already reaching for the terrace door, and then stopped. She turned back. "For what it's worth," she said, "your collar's crooked again." Caleb looked down, startled, reaching for his tie, and found it perfectly straight. When he looked up, she was already walking away, a small private smile on her face, that she didn't bother to hide, because she knew he couldn't see it from where he stood. Inside the reception had reached that particular hour of a wedding where the formal structure dissolves into something looser. The cake had been cut. The first dances completed. The DJ had transitioned from careful family-friendly selections to the songs people actually wanted to move to. Isabella found herself back at the bar, a glass of wine in hand that she had no intention of finishing, watching the room with the detached observational habit she couldn't fully switch off even at a wedding. "You disappeared," said a voice at her elbow. Richard Calloway, predictably. "I needed air. I was hoping to finish our conversation about the Series C round." "Richard, we're at a wedding. Can the pitch wait until Monday?" "Everything's a pitch if you know how to listen for it," he said, smiling in that particular way men like him always smiled. Like charm was a business tool they'd optimized rather than a genuine quality they possessed. "I just think Vance Dynamics could use a partner who understands. I have partners, Richard. I have a board. I have a legal team of 11 attorneys who would have very strong opinions about me discussing capital structure at a wedding reception." "Fair enough." He held up his hands, the universal gesture of a man pretending to retreat while actually just repositioning. "Who was that you were talking to outside?" "Didn't recognize him. Not one of the usual crowd." Isabella's grip tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass. "A friend of the groom's. Military type." "Something like that." "Interesting." Richard's eyes lingered a beat too long, calculating something Isabella didn't care to examine. "Not your usual company." "I don't have usual company, Richard. I have acquaintances and I have obligations. Tonight, mercifully, is neither." He laughed, took the dismissal as gracefully as a man like him could manage, and drifted off toward another cluster of guests who might prove more receptive to whatever he was selling. Isabella turned back toward the dance floor and found her eyes searching without her full permission for a tall man with dark hair and tired eyes standing near a marble pillar. She found him instead sitting at a table near the edge of the room, phone in hand, a small smile on his face as he looked at something on the screen. She recognized that particular kind of smile. Immediately, the involuntary, helpless smile of a parent looking at a photo of their child. She walked over before she'd consciously decided to. "Is that her?" Isabella asked, nodding toward the phone. Caleb looked up, startled, then turned the screen toward her without hesitation. A little girl with dark curls and Caleb's same serious eyes stared back from the photo, gap-toothed grin, wearing a superhero cape over a princess dress, clearly unbothered by the contradiction. "Mia," Caleb said, and his whole face changed when he said her name, the guardedness softening into something unguarded and pure. "She insisted on wearing this to the babysitters tonight. Told me superheroes can be princesses too. I didn't have the energy to argue." "She's right," Isabella said. "Why should anyone have to choose?" "That's exactly what she said, word for word." Caleb studied her for a moment. "You want kids?" The question landed with more weight than either of them expected. Isabella considered lying, considered deflecting with the smooth, practiced non-answer she gave reporters who asked about her personal life. Instead, she found herself telling the truth again for the second time that night. "I used to think I didn't have time," she said. "Now I think I never let myself want it, because wanting things I couldn't control terrified me more than not having them at all." That's a very honest answer for a CEO. "You keep pulling honest answers out of me, Mr. Rhodes. I don't know what that says about you." "Maybe it says I'm a good listener." "Maybe." She sat down across from him, not asking permission, and he didn't seem to mind. Or maybe it's just easier to tell the truth to someone who isn't asking for anything back. We already covered that theory outside. We did. I'm testing whether it holds up under repeated conditions. Scientific method. Caleb laughed, a real laugh, this time low and surprised, like it had escaped before he'd decided to let it. "You run experiments on strangers at weddings. Only the interesting ones. Should I be flattered or concerned?" "Both, probably." Isabella glanced at his phone screen again, at the little girl frozen mid-laugh in her cape and princess dress. "She looks like she has your eyes." "Everyone says that. Her mother used to say it too. Said it was unfair that I got to see myself reflected back at me every day, and she didn't. His voice caught slightly on the word, used to a small hitch that he covered quickly by clearing his throat. Sorry. I don't usually talk about Sarah this much, especially not to people I just met. You don't have to apologize for loving someone, Caleb, or for missing her. I don't miss her the way people expect me to, he admitted, and this confession seemed to cost him more than the others. Not anymore. Not every day. Some days I go from morning to night and I don't think about her once, and then I feel guilty about that, like forgetting to grieve is its own kind of betrayal. It's not betrayal, Isabella said quietly. It's healing. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one. How do you know that? I don't actually. Not from personal experience. I've never lost someone the way you lost her. She paused, considering how much further to go, then decided the terrace conversation had already opened this door, and there was no point pretending otherwise. But I've watched myself grieve things in slow motion my whole life, my father's approval mostly, and later, my own capacity to feel anything without immediately trying to monetize or control it. I know what it looks like when someone confuses moving forward with moving on. They're not the same thing. You can move forward and still carry someone with you. The two aren't in competition. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that had shifted from cautious curiosity into something closer to genuine attention. The look of a man who had just realized the person across from him understood something about him that most people never bothered to look for. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? Honestly, exactly what Danny told me. The glacier. Cold, unreachable, allergic to anything that isn't a spreadsheet. And now I think the glacier's an act, a good one, but an act. Isabella felt something in her chest tighten and loosen simultaneously, the particular sensation of being seen accurately by someone for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. It should have frightened her. In another context with another man it might have. Instead, it felt like relief, like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying at an angle that strained something deep in her spine. Don't tell anyone, she said, half joking, half serious. The act is load-bearing. The entire company is built on the assumption that I don't have feelings that could be exploited in a negotiation. Your secret's safe with me. I'm not in a position to negotiate anything with you. I fix boat engines and pick my daughter up from preschool. I don't have anything you'd want to exploit. That's where you're wrong, Caleb Rhodes. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, low and quiet, meant for him alone, even in a room full of 200 people. You have something I want very badly, and it has nothing to do with negotiation. The air between them changed instantly, thickened the easy conversational rhythm they'd built, collapsing into something more charged, more dangerous. Caleb's eyes searched hers, looking for the joke, the deflection, the exit ramp that would let them both retreat back to safer territory. He didn't find one. Isabella, I know, she said quickly, cutting him off before he could finish whatever sentence was forming an apology, probably, or a retreat, or some careful explanation about why this couldn't happen, all of which she already understood without needing to hear them spoken aloud. I know it's complicated. I know you have Mia. I know I have a company and a board and a life that doesn't leave room for anything unplanned. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. Then what are you asking for? I don't know yet, she admitted. Maybe nothing. Maybe I just wanted to say it out loud once to someone before the night ends, and we both go back to being strangers who happen to stand on the same terrace for 20 minutes. Caleb was quiet, his jaw working slightly, the internal battle playing out plainly across his features for anyone patient enough to read it. Isabella had built a career on reading exactly this kind of hesitation in men across conference tables, learning to identify the precise moment when caution tipped toward decision. She recognized it now, watched it happen in real time, and made herself wait instead of pushing. Because pushing would have violated the one rule she'd set for herself the moment she decided to say something true. I'm scared, Caleb said finally, and the admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Not of you. Of this. Of wanting something again and having it taken away. Mia's already lost one parent. If I let myself fall into something and it goes wrong, she loses again too. I can't do that to her. I won't. I understand, Isabella said, and she did more than he probably realized. I'm not asking you to risk anything tonight. I'm just telling you the truth because you've been telling me the truth all evening, and it seemed unfair to keep holding mine back. What is your truth exactly? She considered the question for a long moment, aware that whatever she said next would either open a door or close it permanently, and that either outcome would matter more than she was fully prepared for. My truth, she said slowly, is that I fixed your collar because I wanted an excuse to touch you. I told myself it was because it was crooked, and it was crooked, but that's not why I did it. I did it because something about the way you stood there alone holding a drink you weren't drinking made me want to be close to you, in a way I haven't wanted to be close to anyone in longer than I can remember. And I don't know what to do with that feeling because I've spent 15 years building a life where feelings like that don't have a place to live. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Isabella began to wonder if she'd made an enormous, unrecoverable mistake, the kind of miscalculation she never allowed herself in business, the kind that came from moving too fast on incomplete information. Then Caleb reached across the table, slowly giving her every opportunity to pull away, and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and rough, calloused from work that had nothing to do with boardrooms or spreadsheets, and the contact sent a current through Isabella's entire body that no handshake, no negotiation, no carefully orchestrated business dinner had ever produced. I don't know how to do this either, Caleb said quietly. I haven't wanted anything like this in 4 years. I didn't think I would again. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't feel something too, because that would be its own kind of lie, and I think we've said enough true things tonight that adding a lie on top of them would ruin whatever this is. Whatever this is, Isabella repeated softly. Yeah. His thumb moved slightly against the back of her hand, an unconscious gesture tender and uncertain at once. I don't know what to call it yet. We don't have to name it tonight. No, he agreed. We don't. They sat like that for a long moment, hands touching across a table at a wedding. Neither of them had expected to matter the music and laughter of the reception continuing around them, oblivious to the quiet, seismic shift occurring in the small space between two people who had walked in as strangers and were leaving as something neither of them had a name for yet. Danny found them 20 minutes later, still sitting together, still talking in low voices about nothing important and everything important at once. Mia's favorite cartoons, Isabella's terrible cooking, the specific way grief and ambition had each shaped them into people who'd forgotten how to let anyone close. Well, would you look at this? Danny said, grinning at Caleb with unrestrained delight. I leave you alone for 2 hours, and you're holding hands with the glacier. Danny, Caleb warned. I'm just saying this is the most interesting thing that's happened at my wedding, besides my own vows, and my wife would be very offended to hear me say that. Go dance with your wife, Isabella said, though there was warmth in it rather than dismissal. I'm going. Danny backed away, still grinning, already reaching for his phone, presumably to text his own new bride about what he'd witnessed. For the record, Caleb, I haven't seen you smile like that in years. Whatever this is, don't overthink it into the ground. You're good at that. Don't. He disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Caleb looking faintly embarrassed, and Isabella watching him with quiet amusement. He's not wrong, you know, she said, about the overthinking. I've had a lot of practice. Practice doesn't always mean it's serving you well. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something settling in his expression. Not certainty exactly, but a kind of tentative openness that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Can I ask you something else? You can ask. Would you want to see Mia sometime? Not as anything official. Just if this is something we're actually going to try. I'd want you to meet her eventually. She's the most important person in my life. If you're going to be part of mine, even a small part, she'd need to be part of the conversation. The request landed with more weight than a simple invitation should have carried, and Isabella understood immediately that this was in its own quiet way a test not designed to trap her, but simply an honest expression of what mattered most to him, offered without artifice or agenda. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it more fully than she'd expected to. "Very much." "Okay." Caleb exhaled, something loosening in his shoulders that had been tight since long before this conversation began. "Okay. Then maybe we figure this out. Slowly. No promises, no rushing." "Slowly," Isabella agreed. "I think I can manage slowly. It's not usually my style, but I'm willing to learn." "Everyone's willing to learn something new at a wedding," Caleb said, the corner of his mouth lifting into something that was almost finally a real smile. "It's probably the champagne talking. I've had exactly one glass and I didn't finish it." "Then maybe it's just you," he said, and this time when their eyes met, neither of them looked away. Outside, beyond the terrace doors, the ocean continued its endless rhythm against the shore, indifferent to the small, fragile thing taking shape at a table inside two people who had spent years building walls against exactly this kind of connection, discovering that some walls, no matter how carefully constructed, could not withstand the particular force of being truly seen by another person for the first time in years. The reception would end in a few hours. Guests would drift home. The wedding lights would dim. The ocean would keep rolling in and out, the way it always had, long before either of them arrived and long after they'd gone. But something had shifted in that room tonight that neither of them could fully name yet, and somewhere beneath the careful words and cautious hands, both Caleb Rhodes and Isabella Vance understood without needing to say it aloud that they had each just stepped, however tentatively, onto a path they hadn't known they were looking for. Neither of them knew yet how far that path would take them, or what it would cost, or what it would heal. But for the first time in years, both of them were willing to find out. Danny drifted back into the crowd, and the noise of the reception rose up around them again, but neither Caleb nor Isabella moved from the table. Their hands were still touching, and neither one seemed willing to be the first to pull away. "I should probably let go of your hand," Isabella said, though she made no move to do so. "Probably," Caleb agreed, and didn't move either. "People are staring." "Let them stare. I haven't given anyone a reason to talk about me in years. Might as well make it count." She laughed, soft and surprised, and finally slid her hand back, though slowly, like she was testing how much distance either of them actually wanted. "Walk with me," she said. "Not back to the terrace, just around. I don't want to sit still anymore." They stood and Caleb offered his arm without thinking about it, an old habit from a life that felt like someone else's now, and Isabella took it without hesitation, which surprised them both. They moved along the edge of the reception hall, past tables of half-eaten cake and champagne flutes, gone flat, past a cluster of bridesmaids taking photos with their shoes off, past Danny's new mother-in-law, crying happy, exhausted tears into a napkin. "Tell me something about your company," Caleb said. "Something that's not in the press releases." "Why?" "Because everyone at this wedding who's talked to you tonight has wanted something from Isabella Vance, the CEO. I'd like to know something about Isabella Vance, the person, if she exists separately from the company at all." Isabella considered the question longer than it probably warranted. "She exists," she said finally. "Barely. Most days I forget to check." "That's a sad answer. It's an honest one. You did say you preferred honest." "I do. Doesn't mean it isn't sad." They walked in silence for a few steps past the open doors leading out toward the water, and Isabella found herself steering them that direction without entirely deciding to. "Vance Dynamics started in my father's garage," she said. "Actually started there, not the mythologized version they put in magazine profiles. I was 22. I had an idea for a logistics algorithm that nobody wanted to fund, because I was a 22-year-old woman with no track record. And my father let me use his garage because my mother made him, not because he believed in me." "He believes in you now, I assume?" "Given the 400 million. He believes in the 400 million. That's different from believing in me." She said it flatly, without self-pity, the way someone states a fact they've made peace with a long time ago, even if the peace was imperfect and cost something to maintain. "I fired him from the board 6 years ago." Did Danny mention that? He mentioned it. What he probably didn't mention is that it was the first time in my entire life my father looked at me like I'd actually surprised him. Not proud. Surprised. Like he'd finally run out of ways to underestimate what I was capable of. She exhaled a short, humorless sound. I built an empire trying to prove something to a man who still calls me sweetheart in board meetings when he wants to remind everyone in the room that he changed my diapers. I don't know if I've ever built anything for myself. I think I've just been building an argument. Caleb didn't respond right away. He let the words sit in the space between them the same way she'd let his confession about Sarah sit earlier without rushing to fill the silence with reassurance he hadn't asked for. "That sounds exhausting," he said finally. "It is." "When does it stop, the argument?" "I don't know," Isabel admitted. "I used to think it would stop the day the company hit $1 billion in valuation. Then it was the day we went public. Then it was the day I made Forbes's cover. Every time I hit the number I'd set for myself, there was already a new number waiting behind it." She glanced at him sideways. "You probably think that's pathetic." "I don't think it's pathetic. I think it's lonely." He met her eyes. There's a difference. They'd reached the terrace doors again, the same spot from earlier, though the light had changed completely. Full dark. Now the ocean visible only as a shifting black expanse beneath a scatter of stars. The wedding lights strung along the railing casting everything in warm amber. Isabella stepped through the doors first, and Caleb followed, and this time neither of them pretended it was an accident. "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone?" Isabella said, her hands resting on the stone railing, the wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face. "Only if you want to. I want to." She turned to face him fully. "I've had exactly 2 relationships in the last 10 years, and both of them ended for the same reason. The men said I made them feel like a line item, like I was managing them instead of loving them. And the worst part is I couldn't even argue with them because I think they were right. I don't know how to be with someone without trying to optimize the relationship into something efficient. I don't know how to just be uncertain with another person and let it be okay. And tonight I fixed a stranger's collar because I wanted an excuse to touch him, and then I told him the truth about it instead of managing the moment into something safer, and I have no idea what that means, except that it scares me more than any board meeting I've ever walked into." Caleb stepped closer slowly, the same deliberate care he'd have used approaching something wounded and unpredictable. "I'm not going to pretend I have this figured out either," he said. "I've spent 4 years telling myself that the only job I have left is keeping Mia safe and steady, and that anything else is a distraction I can't afford. But standing here right now looking at you, I don't feel like this is a distraction. I feel like it's the first thing in 4 years that isn't." "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone you met 2 hours ago." "Probably." He was close enough now that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. "You want me to take it back?" "No," Isabella said, and her voice had dropped quieter, rougher than the crisp boardroom cadence she used with everyone else in her life. "I don't want you to take it back at all." The space between them had narrowed to almost nothing. Caleb could see the exact moment Isabella's composure cracked. Not shattered, just cracked. A hairline fracture running through the careful architecture she'd built around herself for 15 years, and he understood with a clarity that startled him that he wanted to be the reason for that crack more than he'd wanted anything in longer than he could remember. His eyes dropped involuntarily to her mouth. Just for a second, just long enough. Isabella noticed. Of course she noticed everything. It was the entire foundation of how she'd built an empire, reading the smallest signals before anyone else in the room even registered them existed. And instead of stepping back, instead of restoring the professional distance that had protected her for so long, she stepped closer until there was barely any air left between them at all. "Stop staring at my lips," she said low, almost a whisper, and it wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation dressed as a warning, and they both knew it the instant the words left her mouth. Caleb's breath caught. "Then stop making it impossible not to." "I'm not doing anything." "You're doing everything. You have been all night." The tension between them had stopped being subtext hours ago. Now it stood in the open, undisguised, impossible to talk around any further. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the kind of stillness that exists right before something irreversible happens, when both people understand exactly what's about to occur, and neither one is willing to be the person who stops it, and neither is entirely ready to be the person who starts it either. It was Isabella who closed the last distance, rising slightly onto the balls of her feet, and it was Caleb who met her the rest of the way, his hand coming up to rest against the side of her jaw, with a gentleness that seemed to undo something in her more thoroughly than any kiss could have on its own. The kiss itself was brief, careful testing, both of them holding back more than they were giving, but it left something altered in the air around them, a line crossed that neither of them could uncross, even if they'd wanted to. Isabella pulled back first, her hand pressed flat against his chest, not pushing him away, just needing the contact to steady something that had come loose inside her. "That was," she started. "Yeah," Caleb said. "It was." "I don't do this," she said, and there was something almost bewildered in her voice, like she was hearing herself say the words and didn't fully believe them. "I don't kiss strangers on terraces at weddings. I don't let people see me like this. I don't lose control." "Maybe you weren't losing it," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe you were finally putting it down." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but its close cousin, the particular vertigo of a person realizing the ground beneath them has changed shape without warning. "I need to think," she said. I'm not good at this part, the part after. I don't know what comes next." "Neither do I," Caleb admitted. "But I know I don't regret it. Whatever else happens, I don't regret it." "I don't either," Isabella said, and it seemed to cost her something to say it plainly without qualification, without the safety of ambiguity. That might be the most frightening part. Yeah. They exchanged numbers before the night ended, an oddly formal gesture, after everything that had passed between them, typing digits into phones like two people at a business conference, rather than two people who had just kissed on an ocean balcony under wedding lights. Isabella left before the last dance, murmuring something about an early flight to New York for an investor meeting, and Caleb watched her go with the particular ache of a man who has just found something he wasn't looking for and isn't yet sure he's allowed to keep. The days that followed moved strangely. Caleb went back to his normal rhythm, waking at 5:30, making Mia's lunch, dropping her at preschool, spending his mornings under the hoods of boat engines at the marina where he'd worked since leaving the Navy, picking her up at 3:30, dinner bath. Bedtime stories, the quiet, exhausted collapse onto the couch once she was finally asleep. But underneath the familiar routine, something had shifted, a low current running beneath the surface of his ordinary life that hadn't been there before the wedding. He didn't text her for 2 days. Neither did she. On the third day, his phone buzzed while he was elbow deep in a marine diesel engine that smelled like burnt oil and salt water. "I keep thinking about the collar," the message read. "I've fixed exactly 0 other collars since Saturday, and I find that suspicious." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, leaned against the boat's hull, and grinned at his phone like a teenager, which embarrassed him slightly, though there was no one around the marina to witness it, except a seagull perched on a nearby piling, entirely uninterested in his personal life. Suspicious how he typed back. Suspicious, like maybe it wasn't really about the collar at all. "I had a feeling." "Did you? You told me yourself." Terrace, 10 o'clock, very expensive perfume. "You confessed." There was a pause long enough that Caleb wondered if he'd pushed too hard too soon, if the daylight and the distance and the return to her actual life had already convinced her that Saturday night had been a mistake, an aberration, something to be filed away and never repeated. Then his phone buzzed again. "I'm in New York until Thursday. Investor meetings, a product launch review, the usual circus. But I keep losing my train of thought in meetings, which has never happened to me before, and I've decided it's your fault." That's a serious accusation. "I have 11 attorneys. I'm prepared to make it official if necessary." Caleb laughed out loud this time, and it echoed strangely across the empty marina, unfamiliar in a way that made him realize how rarely lately he'd laughed at something that wasn't Mia's antics, or a joke from Danny that he'd humored more than genuinely enjoyed. "Come to dinner when you're back," he typed, before he could second-guess himself into deleting it. "Not fancy. I'm not a fancy dinner guy. But I'd like to see you again if you want that too." The reply took almost 10 minutes this time, long enough that Caleb had gone back to the engine, resigned himself to having asked for too much, too fast, when his phone finally buzzed against the workbench. "I want that too. Thursday. Text me an address." Thursday arrived with a particular kind of nervous energy that Caleb hadn't felt in years. The specific anxious anticipation of a man about to let someone new into a life he'd spent 4 years carefully sealing off from anyone who might complicate it. He'd arranged for Mia to have a sleepover with her cousin, telling himself it was simpler that way, telling himself it had nothing to do with not being ready to introduce a woman he'd known for less than a week to the most important person in his world. He cooked actual cooking. Not the reheated casseroles and boxed macaroni that had become his default since Sarah died, but a real meal: grilled fish and roasted vegetables and a salad he'd looked up online because he genuinely couldn't remember the last time he'd made one from scratch. He set the small table in his equally small kitchen with mismatched plates, because that was all he owned, and lit 2 candles that Mia had given him for Father's Day 2 years ago, and that he'd never once used. Isabella arrived at 7, exactly dressed down in a way Caleb hadn't seen before, jeans and a soft sweater instead of the tailored suits he'd only ever seen her in, her hair loose, instead of pulled back into the severe knot she wore for board meetings. She looked, he thought, almost startlingly young, like the woman underneath the CEO had finally been given permission to step outside for the evening. "You look nervous," she said, standing in his doorway, taking in the small house behind him, the toys scattered near the couch, that he hadn't quite managed to hide the child's drawings taped to the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen doorway. The general modest disorder of a life built around a 4-year-old rather than a design magazine. "I am nervous," Caleb admitted. "I haven't had anyone over for dinner who wasn't Danny or my sister in longer than I want to say out loud. For what it's worth, I'm nervous too. I don't know what to do with my hands when I'm not holding a presentation clicker." "You could try holding a wine glass. I have wine. I don't know if it's good wine. I bought it based on the label." "That's exactly how I choose wine too, so we should be fine." The evening unfolded slower and easier than either of them expected. They ate at the small kitchen table, knees occasionally brushing beneath it, and Isabella asked questions about Mia with a genuine curiosity that surprised Caleb, not the polite deflecting interest people usually performed around single fathers, but real questions, the kind that required him to actually think about the answers. "What's she like?" Isabella asked. Not the 4-year-old summary. What's she actually like underneath that? Caleb considered the question seriously. "She's braver than me," he said finally. "She doesn't remember her mother, not really. She was too young when Sarah died, but she asks about her sometimes in this completely matter-of-fact way, like she's asking about the weather. What was Mommy's favorite color? Just like that. No drama, no crying, just curiosity. I'm the one who has to leave the room sometimes." He paused. "She's stubborn, relentlessly stubborn. Once she decides something, there's no talking her out of it. She decided at 3 that she wanted to be a marine biologist and an astronaut simultaneously, and when I told her that might be logistically difficult, she informed me that I clearly hadn't thought hard enough about it." Isabella laughed, delighted. "She sounds like she'd terrify my board. She'd probably fire half of them within a week. Honestly, given some of the decisions they've made lately, that might be an improvement." They talked for hours after the food was gone, the candles burning down to uneven stubs. The conversation moving easily between light and heavy, without either of them managing the transitions the way they both managed everything else in their lives. Isabella told him about her mother, a woman who loved her, but had never quite forgiven her for choosing ambition over the quieter life she'd imagined for her daughter. Caleb told her about the specific loneliness of coming home from deployment to an empty house, about the year he couldn't bring himself to sleep in the bedroom he'd shared with Sarah, and slept on the couch instead, until his sister finally staged an intervention. "Can I ask you something difficult?" Isabella said somewhere near midnight, her voice softer now, less guarded than Caleb had heard it even on the terrace. "You can ask. Do you think you're ready for this? For me, for whatever this is turning into? Or am I asking you to move faster than you actually want to move because I don't know how to want something slowly? I've never had to. Everything else in my life I've pursued at full speed the moment I decided I wanted it. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture from the wedding, though it felt different now, less like an experiment and more like a decision. I don't know if I'm ready, he said honestly. I don't know if ready is even the right word for something like this, but I know that every day since Saturday, I've thought about you, more than I've thought about anything else, including things I'm supposed to think about, like invoices and Mia's dentist appointment, and that scares the hell out of me, because I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone back in far enough to matter that much ever again. And now I think maybe that promise was more about protecting myself than protecting Mia. And I'm starting to think that's not fair to either of us. She deserves to see me happy, not just safe. I just don't know how to do both at once. Happy and safe. It feels like they might be in competition. They don't have to be, Isabella said, echoing words she'd said before, though this time they carried more weight tested now against real stakes rather than abstract philosophy on a terrace. I know that because you told me that actually, about superheroes and princesses. Mia was right. Why should you have to choose? Caleb smiled, something loosening in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could remember. When did you get so wise about parenting? You said you'd never had time to want kids. I didn't say I'd never thought about it. I said I never let myself want it. She squeezed his hand. There's a difference. Remember you taught me that. On the terrace. Yuck. The weeks that followed built slowly, carefully, both of them navigating the strange new territory, with the caution of people who understood exactly how much they had to lose. Isabella flew back to California more often than her schedule technically allowed, citing manufactured meetings with West Coast investors, that her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, eventually stopped bothering to schedule around because she'd figured out the pattern within the first 2 weeks. You know I know, right? Priya said one Tuesday afternoon, setting a stack of contracts on Isabella's desk in the New York office. The West Coast trips. I know they're not all investor meetings. Isabella didn't look up from her laptop, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. I don't know what you're referring to. Your calendar has more San Diego trips in the last month than in the previous entire year, and you come back from all of them in an unusually good mood, which, no offense, is not your default setting. I'm always in a good mood, Priya. You threw a stapler at Marcus from legal in March. He deserved it. He filed the Henderson brief a day late. You're deflecting. Isabella finally looked up, and something in her expression, open, almost sheepish, entirely unlike the woman who ran the company with icy efficiency, made Priya's teasing grin soften into something gentler. His name is Caleb, Isabella said. He has a daughter. He fixes boat engines for a living, and he's the most honest person I've ever met, and I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't want to stop doing it. Good, Priya said simply. You've needed this for a long time. I just didn't think you'd ever actually let it happen. Neither did I. The first time Isabella met Mia happened almost by accident 4 weeks after the wedding on a Saturday afternoon that Caleb hadn't planned to include her in at all. He'd invited Isabella over for lunch, intending for Mia to be at her scheduled playdate for the full afternoon. But the playdate's mother called at noon with a stomach bug spreading through the house, and Caleb found himself picking his daughter up early, with no time to warn Isabella, who was already 20 minutes from arriving. I have to tell you something, he said into the phone, driving with Mia buckled into her car seat behind him, chattering about a cartoon she'd watched at her friend's house. Change of plans. Mia's with me. I understand completely if you want to reschedule. I know this is a lot faster than we talked about. There was a pause on the line, and Caleb braced himself for the careful diplomatic retreat he half expected. Do you want me to reschedule? Isabella asked instead, or are you just worried I'm not ready? Both maybe. I've been ready to meet her since you showed me her photo at the wedding, Isabella said. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb, not unless you want me to. He glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter, at her small, serious face turned toward the window, and felt something settle in his chest that had been anxious and unresolved for weeks. "I don't want you to," he said. "Come over. Just be patient with her. She's not shy exactly, but she takes her time deciding about people." "I can be patient. I run board meetings for a living. I've developed a very high tolerance for people taking their time deciding things." When Isabella arrived 20 minutes later, she found Mia sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by a small army of plastic dinosaurs deeply engaged in what appeared to be a complex diplomatic negotiation between a triceratops and two velociraptors. She looked up when Isabella walked in, studied her with an unblinking, assessing gaze that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of her own expression during hostile takeover negotiations, and said nothing for a long moment. "Hi," Isabella said, finally crouching down slowly to bring herself to something closer to the child's eye level without invading the space around the dinosaurs. "I'm Isabella. Your dad told me you're working on something important over here." "It's a peace treaty," Mia said seriously. "The Triceratops and the Raptors have been fighting over the watering hole, but nobody's winning, so now they have to talk about it instead." "That sounds very sensible. I have meetings like that sometimes. Two sides who both think they're right, and someone has to help them figure out how to share." Mia considered this information with the gravity of a much older child. "Are you a dinosaur mediator?" "Something like that. I run a company, which mostly means I spend my days helping grown-ups stop fighting over things so we can all get back to work." "That sounds boring." "Some days it really is." Mia studied her a moment longer, then held out one of the smaller dinosaurs, a Stegosaurus slightly chewed at one spike from what Caleb would later explain was an incident involving the family dog 3 Christmases ago. "You can be on the Triceratops's side," she said. "He needs help. The raptors keep ganging up on him." Isabella accepted the dinosaur with a solemnity that made Caleb, watching from the kitchen doorway, feel something in his chest crack open in an entirely different way than it had on the terrace weeks earlier. Not romantic, not charged, just quietly, overwhelmingly grateful. They played on the living room floor for the better part of an hour, Isabella negotiating an elaborate peace settlement between warring plastic reptiles with the same focused intensity she brought to 9-figure acquisitions, while Caleb made lunch in the kitchen and periodically leaned against the doorway just to watch, unable to fully believe what he was seeing. "She's good with her," Danny said later that week when Caleb told him about the afternoon over beers at the marina. "That surprise you?" "Honestly, a little. I don't know what I expected. Someone more removed maybe. Someone who'd be polite but distant, who'd see Mia as an obstacle to navigate rather than a person to actually engage with. And instead, Mia asked me last night if Isabella could come to her school's family day next month. And I didn't know what to say, because that felt like a much bigger step than dinosaur diplomacy on a Saturday afternoon." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd ask." Caleb turned his beer bottle slowly in his hands. "I'm scared, Danny. Not of Isabella. Of how fast this is moving, of how much Mia's already attached, of what happens to both of us if it doesn't work out. She's not just risking her own heart if this falls apart. She's risking Mia's too, and Mia's already lost one parent. I don't know if I can survive watching her lose someone else she's let herself love even a little." Danny was quiet for a moment, uncharacteristically serious. "You know what I think," he said finally. "I think you've spent 4 years so afraid of losing something else that you forgot the alternative to loving carefully isn't safety. It's just a different kind of loss, slower, quieter, but it's still loss, man. Mia growing up with a father who never let himself be happy, that's a loss too. Just one that doesn't announce itself as loudly." Caleb didn't answer right away, turning the words over, feeling the truth in them settle uncomfortably against instincts he'd spent years reinforcing. "When did you get so smart about this?" he said finally. "I've been married 3 months. I've learned an enormous amount very quickly, mostly from making mistakes." Danny clapped him on the shoulder. "Ask her about family day, Caleb. Let Mia have this if it's real. And if you're not sure it's real yet, ask yourself honestly, instead of deciding in advance, that it can't be just because deciding that feels safer than finding out." Isabella came to Family Day. She stood beside Caleb in the crowded gymnasium watching Mia proudly present a crayon drawing of what she called "my whole family," which included Caleb, a small figure meant to represent Isabella holding a dinosaur, and carefully deliberately drawn in the corner, slightly separate from the rest, but clearly present a figure with long dark hair that Mia identified without prompting as her mother watching from a cloud. Isabella felt something break loose in her chest at the sight of it, something she hadn't expected and didn't fully have language for. She glanced at Caleb and found him already looking at the drawing with an expression of such raw, unguarded emotion that she reached for his hand without thinking, lacing her fingers through his in front of the entire assembled parents and teachers of Mia's preschool class. "She's not trying to replace anyone," Isabella said quietly, watching Mia explain the drawing to her teacher with great enthusiasm. "She's just trying to make room for everyone she loves, all at once." "I know," Caleb said, his voice thick. "That's exactly what she's doing." "Do you think it's too much me being here?" "No," he said, and there was a certainty in his voice that hadn't been there a month earlier. A certainty that had been built slowly, deliberately, out of dinosaur diplomacy and honest conversations, and the accumulated weight of showing up again and again without pretense. "I think it's exactly enough." That evening, after Mia had fallen asleep exhausted from the excitement of Family Day, Caleb and Isabella sat together on the small porch behind his house, the ocean too far away to hear but somehow present anyway, in the particular quality of the night air in the memory of another terrace weeks earlier, where all of this had started with a crooked collar and a truth neither of them had planned to say out loud. "I want to tell you something," Isabella said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because if you interrupt me, I might lose my nerve." "Okay," Caleb said, watching her carefully. "I've spent my whole adult life believing that vulnerability was a liability, something my competitors could exploit, something my board would use against me, something that made me weaker in every room I walked into. I built an entire identity around never letting anyone see the parts of me that weren't useful or impressive or profitable." She took a breath. "And then a stranger's collar was crooked at a wedding, and I touched it, and everything I thought I knew about protecting myself started falling apart, piece by piece, every single time you told me something true, and I found myself for the first time in 15 years wanting to tell you something true back." "Isabella, I'm not finished." She reached for his hand. "I don't know how to promise you certainty, Caleb. I've never promised anyone certainty in my life, because I've never believed it existed. But I can promise you this. I'm not here because it's convenient, or because you're a novelty, or because I'm bored with my usual life. I'm here because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I want something I can't control, and instead of running from that, I want to find out what happens if I let myself have it." Caleb was quiet for the long moment, the weight of her words settling over both of them like something almost physical. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he made no effort to disguise. "I spent 4 years telling myself I was protecting Mia by keeping everyone at arm's length," he said. "But watching her today, showing everyone that drawing so proud of the family she's building for herself out of the pieces she's got, I think maybe I had it backwards. I think maybe protecting her actually looks like letting her watch her father choose to be brave again. Even when it's terrifying. Especially when it's terrifying." "Are you saying you're choosing this?" Isabella asked. And for the first time since he'd met her, Caleb heard genuine uncertainty in her voice, the particular vulnerability of a woman who had learned to expect disappointment as the default outcome of wanting things. "I'm saying," Caleb said, drawing her closer, "that I've been falling for you since you fixed my collar, and I've spent a month trying to talk myself out of it because falling terrifies me more than anything I ever faced overseas. But I'm done fighting it. I don't want to protect myself from you anymore. I just want to see where this goes." The kiss that followed was nothing like the tentative testing one from the terrace weeks earlier. It was slower, surer, carrying the accumulated weight of a month of honest conversations and small acts of trust of dinosaur diplomacy and Family Day drawings and late-night phone calls that stretched past midnight, because neither of them wanted to be the one to say goodnight first. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together in the quiet dark of the porch, Isabella spoke again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "I have to tell you something else," she said. Something less romantic and considerably more complicated. Caleb pulled back slightly, searching her face. What is it? My board is starting to ask questions. About my schedule, about the West Coast trips, about why I've been distracted in meetings for the first time in company history. She hesitated. There are people on that board, Caleb, who would very much like an excuse to suggest I'm no longer focused enough to run Vance Dynamics the way I have been. My father's old allies mostly. People who never fully accepted a woman running things and have been waiting for a reason to make that argument again. You think they'd use this against you, us? I think powerful people look for weaknesses wherever they can find them. And right now, the truth is that I have a personal life for the first time in 15 years, and personal lives create leverage in the hands of people who want to use them. She met his eyes steady, despite the fear underneath. I don't say this to scare you away. I say it because I promised myself I wouldn't hide anything from you, even the parts that are difficult, even the parts that might mean this gets harder before it gets easier. Caleb held her gaze, and something settled in him. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, but something steadier beneath it, a resolve that surprised him with how solid it felt. Then we'll figure out the difficult parts when they come, he said. I didn't survive 2 deployments and 4 years of raising a daughter alone by running from things that got complicated. I'm not going to start running now, not from you. Isabella exhaled something in her shoulders, releasing that Caleb suspected she'd been carrying since long before this conversation began, perhaps since the wedding, perhaps since long before that, since whatever year of her life had taught her that wanting things openly was more dangerous than wanting them in careful, guarded silence. Okay, she said quietly. Then we figure it out together. Behind them, through the thin walls of the small house, Mia stirred in her sleep and murmured something unintelligible, and both of them fell silent for a moment, listening, before Isabella spoke again, so quiet it was almost lost in the night air. For what it's worth, she said. I think that little girl in there already decided this was going to work out long before either of us caught up to her. Kids see things clearly sometimes before the adults around them finish overthinking it. She usually does, Caleb agreed, pulling Isabella closer against his side, both of them looking out at the dark yard, at the ordinary night, settling over an ordinary house that had in the span of 1 month become the unlikely center of something neither of them had expected to find, and neither of them now was willing to let go. But even as the words left her mouth, Isabella knew the peace of that porch wouldn't last. Somewhere in a boardroom, 3,000 miles away, the people who resented her power were already sharpening the questions they intended to ask, and somewhere in the quiet architecture of Caleb's own heart, an old fear waited patiently for the first real test of everything he'd just promised to risk. Neither of them said it aloud, but both of them felt it, the sense that the hardest part of this story hadn't started yet, and that whatever came next would ask more of them than dinosaur diplomacy and honest conversations on a porch ever could. The following Monday, Isabella walked into the Vance Dynamics boardroom in New York 11 minutes later than she had been in 11 years, and every single person seated around the long glass table noticed. Sorry, she said, setting her tablet down and taking her seat at the head of the table without further explanation. Traffic. Nobody believed her. She could see it in the careful, curious glances exchanged around the room, in the particular stillness of Gerald Ashford's expression, her father's oldest ally on the board, a man who had opposed nearly every decision she'd made since taking full control of the company 6 years earlier. Traffic, Gerald repeated in a tone that made the word sound like an accusation. That's unusual for you, Isabella. You once told me you'd rather walk 40 blocks in the rain than be late to a meeting you'd called yourself. People change, Gerald. Do they? He said it flatly, not quite a question, and let it sit there in the recycled air of the boardroom, while the rest of the members shuffled their agendas and pretended not to be listening as closely as they were. The meeting proceeded through its usual agenda. Quarterly projections, a supply chain issue in the Southeast Asia Manufacturing Division, a proposed acquisition of a smaller logistics firm that Isabella had been quietly building toward for 8 months. She handled all of it with her usual precision, answering questions before they were fully asked, anticipating objections and dismantling them with data, before anyone had a chance to fully articulate their concerns. By any objective measure, she performed exactly as she always had. But Gerald waited until the end, until most of the board had already begun gathering their things before he spoke again. "One more item, if the chair will indulge me," he said, and Isabella felt something in her stomach tighten, the specific instinct of a predator sensing another predator's approach. "Go ahead, Gerald." "There's been some talk," he said, his voice carrying the particular false gentleness of a man who enjoyed delivering unpleasant things slowly, "about your personal life. Frequent trips to San Diego. A man, I understand, a veteran, a mechanic of some kind with a young daughter. Nothing wrong with any of that, of course. Everyone's entitled to a private life." He paused, letting the room absorb the information he'd just planted, like a seed he intended to watch grow. "I only raise it because some of our larger institutional investors have expressed concern about focus, about whether the woman who built this company with singular, relentless discipline is still bringing that same discipline to the job." Isabella kept her expression perfectly composed, the practiced neutrality she'd spent 15 years perfecting, though inside something sharp and cold had begun coiling through her chest. "My personal life is not board business, Gerald. It becomes board business," he said smoothly, "when shareholders start asking whether it's affecting your judgment. When a woman who once fired her own father for a conflict of interest starts making unscheduled trips across the country for reasons that have nothing to do with the company's growth. Are you suggesting I've made a decision that harmed this company? Name one, Gerald. One decision, one dropped deal, one missed deadline in the 8 weeks since you apparently started tracking my travel." Gerald smiled thin and unhurried. "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm simply noting a pattern for the record in case the pattern continues to develop in ways that require the board's attention." "Noted," Isabella said, ending the meeting with a finality that left no room for further discussion. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. The board filed out, murmuring among themselves, and Isabella remained standing at the head of the table long after the room had emptied, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling for the first time in years the particular vertigo of watching something she'd built with her own hands become vulnerable in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Priya found her there 20 minutes later, still standing, still staring out at the skyline. "That bad?" Priya asked quietly. "Gerald knows about Caleb." "Gerald knows about everything. He's had someone watching your calendar for years, probably since your father lost his board seat. This isn't new information for him. It's just new ammunition." "He's going to use it." "Probably," Priya agreed, because she'd never been the kind of assistant who softened hard truths just to make her boss feel better in the moment. "The question is, what you're going to do about it." Isabella turned from the window, and for the first time in longer than Priya could remember, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not the calculated uncertainty she sometimes performed in negotiations to draw out an opponent's position, but real unguarded doubt. "I don't know," Isabella admitted. "I built this company by never giving anyone a reason to question my focus. And now I have a reason, and it's a good one, and I don't know how to make Gerald understand that finding something worth being distracted by isn't the same as losing my grip on everything else." "Maybe you don't need Gerald to understand it," Priya said. "Maybe you just need to keep proving him wrong with results the same way you always have. Let him talk. Let him plant his little seeds. The company's numbers speak louder than his insinuations if you keep the numbers strong. And if I can't, if Caleb, if Mia, if all of it starts pulling my focus in ways I can't fully control." Priya studied her for a long moment. "Then maybe that's a conversation you need to have with yourself, not with Gerald. Because it sounds to me like the real question isn't whether the board will accept this. It's whether you will." Caleb didn't know about the board meeting not that week because Isabella didn't tell him. She told herself it was because there was nothing actionable. Yet nothing beyond Gerald's veiled threats and institutional murmuring. Nothing worth burdening him with when he was already carrying the weight of raising Mia alone and running a small business that left barely enough margin for emergencies. She told herself a lot of things that week, most of them designed to justify the growing distance in her voice during their nightly phone calls. A distance Caleb noticed immediately and didn't know how to name. "You seem far away," he said on the Thursday call nearly 2 weeks after Family Day. "Even for someone who's actually 3,000 miles away." "I'm just tired. It's been a demanding week." "Isabella." He said her name carefully, the way he'd learned to say it when he wanted her to know he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk. "I've spent enough years reading people to know when someone's editing themselves. What's going on?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Caleb wondered if the call had dropped. "There's some tension with my board," she said finally. "Nothing I can't handle, just noise. Politics. It comes with the job." "What kind of noise?" "The kind that doesn't concern you," she said too quickly, and immediately heard how it landed dismissive, walling him off from something she'd promised only weeks earlier not to hide. "Okay," Caleb said, and his voice had gone carefully neutral, the tone he used when he was working hard not to let hurt show through. "If that's how you want to play this." "Caleb, I didn't mean—" "It's fine, Isabella. You don't owe me every detail of your professional life. I get it." But there was an edge underneath the words, and they both heard it. "It's about us," she said finally, the admission dragged out of her by the particular guilt of hearing him retreat. "Someone on my board is using the fact that I've been flying to San Diego as evidence that I'm losing focus, that I'm distracted. He's implying it might affect my ability to run the company the way I have been." The silence on Caleb's end lasted long enough that Isabella began to worry she'd made a mistake telling him at all. "Am I the distraction, Isabella? Is that what he's saying? That being with me is making you worse at your job?" "That's not what I think. That's not what I asked." His voice had hardened slightly, an old defensive instinct surfacing, the same one that had kept him guarded and alone for 4 years. "I asked if that's what he's saying. Because if it is, I need to know whether you believe it too, even a little, even somewhere you haven't said out loud yet." "I don't believe it," Isabella said, firm now, some of her usual certainty returning to her voice. "I believe Gerald Ashford has been looking for a way to undermine me since the day I fired my father from this board, and he's finally found one he thinks might stick. This isn't about you, Caleb. This is about a man who's never accepted that a woman built this company better than he ever could have. But it's using me as the weapon." "Yes," she admitted. "It is. And I hate that. I hate that something as good as what we have is being twisted into ammunition by people who've never once cared about anything except protecting their own influence." Caleb exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his voice, though not all of it. "I need you to be honest with me about something, and I need you not to soften it for my benefit. Okay? Is there a version of this where you decide the cost is too high? Where the board pressure gets bad enough that you decide not because you want to, but because it's the practical choice that it's easier to step back from this than to keep fighting for it?" The question hung in the air between them, 3,000 miles of phone line carrying more weight than either of them was fully prepared for. "I don't know," Isabella said, and the honesty of it cost her visibly, even over the phone. "I want to tell you, no, absolutely not. Nothing could make me choose that. But I've spent 15 years building an identity around never letting anything threaten this company, and I don't actually know with complete certainty what I'll do if the pressure gets significantly worse. I want to be the kind of person who chooses you without hesitation. I don't know yet if I am that person." Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded almost like fear. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. And it's also the thing I least wanted to hear." "I know. Mia's already attached to you, Isabella. She talks about you at breakfast. She asked me last week if you were going to be her stepmom someday, and I didn't know what to tell her because I don't know the answer myself. And now you're telling me there's a version of this where the answer is decided by a board meeting instead of by us. I'm not going to let that happen," Isabella said, urgency rising in her voice now. "I'm telling you my fear, not my plan. My plan is to fight for this. My plan is to prove to Gerald and anyone else who wants to use this against me that I can run this company exactly as well, while also having a life that matters to me. I just needed you to know the fear exists because I promised you honesty, and pretending I'm not scared would be a lie. I appreciate the honesty, Caleb said. I just don't know if it makes me feel better or worse. Probably both, Isabella said quietly. That seems to be the theme of this whole thing. The situation escalated faster than either of them expected. 2 weeks later, a business gossip column, the kind of publication that specialized in unverified insinuation, dressed up as financial journalism, ran a piece titled, "Vance Dynamics, CEO's Secret Romance Raises Investor Eyebrows," featuring a grainy photograph of Isabella and Caleb walking together outside a San Diego restaurant. Mia's hand clasped in Caleb's, taken by someone with a long lens and no scruples about photographing a child without consent. Isabella called Caleb the moment she saw it, her voice tight with a fury that had nowhere productive to land. "They photographed Mia," she said before he'd even finished saying hello. "Whoever did this photographed Mia without permission and published it next to an article implying I'm having some kind of midlife crisis that's destabilizing the company." "I saw it," Caleb said grimly. "Danny sent it to me 20 minutes ago. My sister's already called twice asking if we need to talk to a lawyer about the photo of Mia. I'm handling it. My legal team is already drafting a cease and desist, and I've asked Priya to find out who leaked our location to that photographer, because someone did, and I intend to find out who." "Isabella." Caleb's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something careful and controlled that Isabella recognized from every difficult conversation they'd had since the board meeting. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer, instead of reassuring me the way you've been reassuring me for 2 weeks." "Okay. Is this what it's going to be like? Every time we're seen together, is there going to be a camera, an article, a board member using it against you because I can handle a lot of things? But I don't know if I can handle Mia growing up photographed without her permission because her father fell in love with someone whose life comes with this kind of exposure." Isabella felt the words land like a physical blow. "You're saying you want to end this." "I'm saying I'm scared," Caleb said, echoing her own words back to her from weeks earlier. "And I'm asking you to be honest with me about whether this gets easier or whether it gets worse from here. Because if it only gets worse, if this is the beginning of years of this kind of exposure, I don't know if that's fair to bring into Mia's life. I already lost her mother to something I couldn't control. I don't want to hand her a childhood where every photo of her ends up in some gossip column because her father chose to love someone whose life is public property. That's not fair." Isabella said, her voice cracking slightly for the first time since he'd known her. "You're asking me to promise you something I can't control. I can't guarantee no photographer will ever find us again. I can't guarantee Gerald will stop using this against me. All I can promise you is that I'll fight for us, and that I'll do everything in my power to protect Mia from exactly this kind of exposure going forward. But I can't promise the world will leave us alone, Caleb. Nobody can promise that." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I know you can't. That's what scares me." The silence between them stretched long and painful, 3,000 miles of phone line, carrying a weight neither of them was fully prepared to hold. "Do you need space?" Isabella asked finally, her voice small in a way Caleb had never heard from her before. "Is that what you're telling me, that you need to step back from this?" "I don't know what I need," Caleb admitted. "I need to think. I need to talk to Mia's therapist, actually, and ask her honestly whether this kind of exposure could hurt her, because I don't trust my own judgment right now. I'm too scared to think clearly, and I don't want to make a decision about us out of fear. But I also don't want to ignore the fear if it's telling me something true." "Okay," Isabella said, and Caleb could hear how much the composure cost her. "Take the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk again. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb, whatever happens with us. I want you to know that. This isn't me giving up." "I know," Caleb said. "I'm not giving up either. I just need to think." They hung up without saying goodbye properly, and Isabella sat alone in her New York apartment, staring at the article still open on her laptop screen, at the photograph of Caleb holding his daughter's hand. Both of them caught in a private moment that had been stolen and turned into ammunition against a life she'd only just begun allowing herself to want. Caleb didn't call for 4 days. He spent them in a state of quiet, grinding anxiety, going through the motions of his ordinary routine, the Marina Mia's preschool dinner and bath and bedtime, while his mind circled the same questions without landing on any answers he trusted. He did as he'd told Isabella he would call Mia's therapist, a calm, thoughtful woman named Dr. Alvarez, who had been seeing Mia periodically since Sarah's death, mostly for routine check-ins, to make sure the grief wasn't manifesting in ways that needed more direct intervention. "I appreciate you being thoughtful about this," Dr. Alvarez said after Caleb had explained the situation as clearly as he could manage. "But I want to push back gently on the framing of your question. You're asking me whether exposure could hurt Mia. The more important question is whether losing someone she's grown attached to, someone who's shown up consistently, who's built real trust with her, would hurt her more. You think ending things with Isabella would be worse for Mia than the exposure? I think," Dr. Alvarez said carefully, "that children are remarkably resilient to difficult circumstances when the adults around them are stable and honest. What tends to actually harm children isn't complexity or even public exposure, it's inconsistency. It's adults disappearing from their lives without explanation. Mia has already experienced one enormous, unexplainable loss. If Isabella disappears now after Mia has let herself trust her, that absence will register as another loss, whether or not you frame it that way to her. So you're saying I should stay with Isabella regardless of the risk for Mia's sake? I'm saying," Dr. Alvarez said, "that I can't make this decision for you, and I wouldn't try to. But I'd encourage you to examine honestly whether your fear about exposure is really about protecting Mia, or whether it's about protecting yourself from the risk of losing someone else you've let yourself love. Those are two very different motivations, Caleb, and they deserve two very different answers." The words sat with Caleb for the rest of that day, and well into the night, long after Mia had fallen asleep, long after he'd exhausted every household task he could invent to keep himself from sitting still with his own thoughts. He sat on the same porch where he and Isabella had kissed weeks earlier, the ocean air carrying the same salt and stillness it always did, and finally let himself examine the question honestly, without the protective armor of parental concern disguising something more selfish underneath. He thought about the 4 years since Sarah died. The careful, deliberate walls he'd built. The way he'd told himself repeatedly that the walls existed for Mia's protection, when in truth, if he was finally honest with himself, they'd existed just as much for his own. He thought about how frightened he'd been the moment Isabella fixed his collar, not of her, but of the flicker of hope her touch had ignited in him, hope he'd told himself he no longer had the right to feel. He thought about the drawing Mia had made for Family Day, Isabella holding a dinosaur drawn without hesitation, without the complicated adult calculus Caleb had been running for weeks. Mia hadn't needed to weigh risk against reward. She'd simply recognized someone who showed up for her again and again, and drawn her into the family without asking permission from anyone's fear. By the time the porch light attracted the first moths of the evening, Caleb had reached a decision that felt less like a choice, and more like something he'd been circling toward since the moment he'd frozen at a wedding reception. Collar-crooked grief still raw, unprepared for a stranger's gentle hands. He called Isabella at 11 that night, later than either of them usually called, and she picked up on the first ring as though she'd been sitting with her phone in her hand for hours waiting. "Caleb, I've been an idiot," he said without preamble. "I let fear make a decision I should have made, with something braver than fear." "What decision?" "The decision to keep choosing you. Every day, regardless of what Gerald Ashford does, regardless of what any photographer captures, regardless of how complicated this gets. I spent 4 years telling myself that protecting Mia meant keeping her safe from loss. But I talked to her therapist today, and she made me realize that protecting Mia actually means being consistent, being honest, being someone who doesn't disappear the moment something gets hard. And I don't want to be the father who disappeared on her twice, once because grief took her mother, and once because fear took someone she'd already learned to love." Isabella was quiet on the other end, and Caleb could hear something in the silence, the particular sound of someone crying carefully, trying not to let the emotion overwhelm the moment. "I'm not asking you to guarantee me anything," Caleb continued. I know you can't promise the exposure stops or that Gerald backs down or that this gets easier before it gets harder. I'm just telling you that I choose to fight through the hard parts with you instead of running from them, because the alternative, the version where I protect myself by staying alone, that's not actually protecting anyone. It's just a slower, quieter kind of losing everything. Caleb, Isabella said, her voice thick with emotion she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. I need you to know something. After we hung up 4 days ago, I almost got on a plane 3 separate times. I almost showed up at your door just to look at you and Mia and remind myself what I was fighting for. I didn't because I wanted to respect the space you asked for, but every single day you didn't call. I was terrified. I'd already lost the best thing that's happened to me in 15 years, and I didn't know how to fix it because for once in my life, there wasn't a strategy I could execute my way out of the problem. You didn't lose it, Caleb said. I'm sorry it took me 4 days to say so. You needed the 4 days. I understand that. I'd rather you take the time to be certain than rush into something you'd resent later. She paused. Does this mean you're in fully whatever comes next with the board, with the press, with all of it? I'm in, Caleb said, and the certainty in his voice was unmistakable, the particular steadiness of a man who had finally stopped fighting a decision his heart had already made weeks earlier. But I need something from you too. Anything. I need you to actually let me help carry this. Not just tell me about the board meetings after they've already happened, and you've already handled everything alone. If we're doing this together, I need to actually be inside it with you, not standing outside the door, wondering what's happening, while you protect me from the details. Okay, Isabella said. That's fair. I've spent 15 years handling everything alone. I don't actually know how to do it any other way. But I'm willing to learn if you're patient with me while I figure it out. I can do patient, Caleb said. I've had a lot of practice. The board meeting where Gerald Ashford made his formal move came 3 weeks later, and this time Isabella walked in with information Caleb had helped her gather: quiet conversations with other board members, careful documentation of Gerald's own conflicts of interest. Evidence that his sudden concern about her focus coincided suspiciously with his private investment in a competing logistics firm that stood to benefit enormously if Isabella were forced out or sidelined. You've been busy, Gerald said when Isabella laid the documentation on the table in front of the assembled board, watching his composure crack for the first time in the 6 years she'd known him. I learned from the best, Gerald. You taught me that information is the only currency that actually matters in this room. I simply decided to spend some of mine. The board vote that followed wasn't close. Gerald Ashford's influence, built over decades of careful alliance building, evaporated within the span of a single meeting once his conflict of interest became impossible to ignore, and within a month he had resigned his board seat entirely, rather than face a formal removal that would have been considerably more public and considerably more humiliating. Isabella called Caleb the moment the vote concluded, her voice carrying a lightness he hadn't heard in weeks. It's done, she said. Gerald's gone. The board's behind me fully, and nobody's questioning my focus anymore. How does it feel? Honestly? She laughed a real laugh, unguarded and relieved. It feels like the first time in this entire process that I actually let myself fight for something using both halves of my life at once, the strategic half and the half that loves you and Mia, enough to risk everything protecting it. I didn't have to choose between them, Caleb. I used them together and it worked better than either one would have alone. I told you they didn't have to be in competition, Caleb said, smiling into the phone. Superheroes and princesses, remember? I remember, Isabella said softly. I think that might be the truest thing anyone's ever taught me, and it came from a 4-year-old with a stegosaurus. That evening, Isabella booked a flight to San Diego, arriving at Caleb's small house just past sunset, and when Mia opened the door before her father could reach it, she looked up at Isabella with the same serious assessing expression from their very first meeting, before breaking into a wide, gap-toothed grin. You're back, Mia said, matter of fact, as though there had never been any real question about it. I'm back? Isabella agreed, crouching down to the little girl's level. And I brought a peace treaty for the Triceratops. I've been thinking about it, and I think I found a better solution to the watering hole problem. Mia's eyes widened with delight, already reaching for Isabella's hand to pull her toward the living room and the waiting army of plastic dinosaurs. And Caleb watched from the doorway with an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a happiness he'd genuinely believed for 4 long years he no longer had the right to feel. But even as he watched them settle onto the floor together, already deep in negotiation over prehistoric territorial disputes, Caleb felt a quieter thought settle beneath the joy. The awareness that Gerald's departure had closed one battle, but that building a life together, blending 2 worlds as different as theirs, would require far more than winning a single boardroom fight. There were still conversations. Neither of them had had yet decisions about the future that would test both of their instincts toward control and self-protection in ways this crisis hadn't fully required. The easy part, he suspected, watching Isabella carefully explain diplomatic protocol to a 4-year-old, was actually just beginning. 6 weeks after Gerald Ashford's resignation, Isabella's mother called on a Tuesday morning. While Isabella was still in bed an hour, she rarely allowed herself to occupy any more, especially not with Caleb still asleep beside her, one arm thrown loosely across her waist. "I saw the papers finally stopped writing about you like you've lost your mind," Eleanor Vance said without any preamble, which was entirely her style. "That's progress, I suppose." "Good morning to you too, Mom." "Don't good morning me. I want to know when I get to meet him. You've been seeing this man for 3 months. Your father's golf partner's daughter saw a photo of you both somewhere in San Diego, and I had to hear about my own daughter's relationship from a woman I dislike at a country club I don't even belong to." Isabella glanced sideways at Caleb, who was stirring now, blinking awake, clearly listening, despite pretending otherwise. "I was going to tell you when the timing was right." "The timing is always going to feel wrong to you, Isabella. That's not a reason. That's an excuse you've perfected since you were 19. Her mother's voice softened slightly. "I just want to meet the man who's made my daughter smile in photographs for the first time since she was in college. That's all. I'm not asking for a ring size." "Mom?" "I'm just saying in case anyone was wondering." Isabella hung up a few minutes later, exhaling, and found Caleb watching her with quiet amusement. "Your mother wants to meet me." "My mother wants to interrogate you and then decide whether you're worthy of continuing to date her daughter, which she will disguise as a friendly dinner." "I can handle a dinner." "You haven't met my mother." "I survived boot camp." "This is worse than boot camp." Isabella settled back against his chest, and he wrapped his arm around her, the easy comfort of it, something that still occasionally startled both of them with how natural it had become. "She's going to ask you about your intentions. She asked my last boyfriend about his 5-year plan on their first meeting, and he didn't have a good answer, and she never let either of us forget it." "What's the right answer?" "There isn't one. She's not actually looking for an answer. She's looking for whether you flinch." "I don't flinch," Caleb said. "I've had people shoot real bullets in my general direction. Your mother's going to have to work harder than that." Isabella laughed, and it was the easy, unguarded laugh that had become more frequent over the months, the sound of a woman who had slowly, carefully allowed herself to stop performing, even in the smallest private moments. The dinner happened 2 weeks later in a private dining room Eleanor Vance had reserved at a restaurant in downtown San Diego that Caleb suspected cost more for a single meal than he typically spent on groceries in a month. Mia stayed home with Caleb's sister for the evening, both Caleb and Isabella agreeing this particular gauntlet was one they'd navigate alone first. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, dressed with the same understated precision Isabella brought to board meetings, and studied Caleb for a long, uncomfortable moment before extending her hand. "So you're the mechanic," she said by way of greeting. "I prefer marine technician," Caleb said, shaking her hand firmly. "But mechanic works too." "My daughter runs a company worth several $100 million. "I'm aware. She mentions it occasionally, usually when she's annoyed at her board." Eleanor's eyebrow lifted slightly, the first crack in her carefully composed expression. "You're not intimidated by that." "Should I be? Most men are. Even the successful ones. Especially the successful ones actually. They can't stand being the less impressive person in a room." "I've never needed to be the most impressive person in a room," Caleb said simply. I spent 6 years in the Navy, learning that the job that matters most isn't always the one that looks the most impressive from the outside. I fix boat engines because it's honest work that lets me pick my daughter up every day at 3:30. That's not a small thing to me, even if it doesn't come with a corner office. Eleanor studied him for another long moment, something in her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. You have a daughter. Mia, she's 4. She likes dinosaurs and thinks princesses can also be superheroes, and she's already decided Isabella belongs in our family before either of us had the courage to say it out loud. Isabella's mentioned her. Extensively, actually, for a woman who used to change the subject any time I asked about her personal life. Eleanor turned to her daughter. You've been sending me photos of a 4-year-old's dinosaur collection for a month, Isabella. I assumed it was some strange new corporate mascot strategy. It's not a strategy, Mom. It's just my life now. Something in the way Isabella said, it's simple, unguarded entirely, without the careful management she usually applied to conversations with her mother, seemed to land more powerfully than anything else that had been said all evening. Eleanor's expression softened fully for the first time. You look happy, she said quietly. I don't think I've seen you actually look happy since you were a little girl before all of this. She gestured vaguely, encompassing the restaurant, the company, the entire architecture of the life Isabella had built. Before all of this started mattering more than anything else did. I am happy, Isabella said, reaching for Caleb's hand under the table. I didn't expect to be. I'd stopped expecting it honestly, but I am. Eleanor looked at Caleb again, and this time her expression carried something warmer, something closer to approval than interrogation. Well, she said. I suppose I should order the good wine then. This seems like an occasion. The dinner went better than either of them expected, and by the time dessert arrived, Eleanor had extracted from Caleb nearly his entire life story, his childhood in Ohio, his decision to enlist at 18, the 2 tours that had taken him to places he still didn't discuss in detail, meeting Sarah at a friend's barbecue during a brief leave, the 4 devastating years since her death, and the slow, careful process of learning to want something again. You lost your wife. Eleanor said, her voice gentler than Caleb had heard it all evening. I'm sorry. That's not a small thing to carry, especially with a small child. It isn't, Caleb agreed. But I've learned something in the last few months that I didn't expect to learn. Grief and happiness aren't actually opposites. I thought they were for a long time. I thought choosing to be happy again meant somehow betraying what I'd lost. Isabella helped me understand that's not true. You can carry someone with you and still move forward. The two aren't in competition. Eleanor glanced at her daughter, something knowing in her expression. That sounds like something Isabella would say. Did you teach her that, or did she teach you? Honestly? Caleb smiled. I think we taught each other, somewhere on a terrace at a wedding months ago. That night, driving home from the restaurant, Isabella rested her head against the passenger window, watching the city lights blur past, a contentment in her expression that Caleb had rarely seen this fully unguarded. That went better than I expected, she admitted. Your mother likes me. My mother likes very few people, so this is a significant development. She turned to look at him. Thank you for tonight, for being honest with her, for not performing some version of yourself you thought she wanted to see. I don't know how to be anyone except myself anymore, Caleb said. I used to be good at performing back when I thought that's what being strong meant. Grief burned that out of me pretty thoroughly. Now I just say what's true and hope it's enough. It's more than enough, Isabella said quietly. It's honestly the thing I love most about you. The word hung between them for a moment, the first time either of them had said it directly without hedging, without wrapping it in qualifiers or careful conditional language. Caleb glanced at her startled, and she met his eyes with a steadiness that told him she'd meant to say it, hadn't let it slip by accident. Say that again, he said. I love you. Isabella said clearer this time, no hesitation at all. I've been circling around it for weeks trying to find the right moment. And I realized tonight, watching you talk to my mother, that there isn't going to be a perfect moment. There's just the truth whenever you're brave enough to say it. Caleb pulled the car over right there on the quiet residential street and turned to face her fully. "I love you too," he said. "I think I've loved you since you fixed my collar and lied about why you did it." "I wasn't lying. It really was crooked. You were lying about the reason you fixed it, and we both knew it the moment you walked away." Isabella laughed, soft and warm, and leaned across the console to kiss him, slow and unhurried. Nothing like the charged, testing kiss on the terrace months earlier. This one carried the weight of everything they'd built since then. The dinosaur diplomacy, and the board meetings, and the 4 days of silence, and the choice made deliberately by both of them to keep showing up for each other, despite every reasonable fear that told them not to. China. The next test came from a direction neither of them expected. 3 weeks after the dinner with Eleanor, Caleb's sister, Rachel called him in a state of quiet panic, asking him to come over immediately, and when he arrived, he found her sitting at her kitchen table, with a folder of old photographs, and a look on her face he hadn't seen since Sarah's funeral. "I found these going through Mom's things," Rachel said, sliding the folder toward him. "Sarah's stuff, from when you two first met. I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe you'd want them, or maybe it would upset you, and I didn't know which, so I called you instead of just dropping them off." Caleb opened the folder slowly, and his breath caught at the photographs inside Sarah at 23, laughing at some barbecue. He barely remembered attending Sarah in her wedding dress, adjusting her own veil in a mirror. Sarah pregnant with Mia, one hand resting on her belly, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. "I haven't seen most of these," he said quietly. "Are you okay?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs, feeling the old familiar ache rise up alongside something else, something he hadn't expected to feel alongside grief anymore, a kind of gentle gratitude. The recognition that loving Sarah had shaped him into someone capable of loving again, rather than someone permanently broken by her loss. "I'm okay," he said finally, and meant it. "It's strange. A few months ago, looking at these would have wrecked me for days. Right now, I just feel grateful mostly. Grateful I got to love her even for the short time I did. Grateful Mia exists because of it." He glanced up at his sister. "I don't feel guilty anymore, Rachel, about being happy with Isabella. I think that's new." "I'm glad," Rachel said, relief plain on her face. "I've worried about you for 4 years. I've watched you go through the motions of being a father without ever really letting yourself live. Isabella's changed something in you. I don't know how else to say it." "She has," Caleb agreed. "I think I changed something in her too." He took the folder home with him that evening, and that night after Mia was asleep, he showed the photographs to Isabella, watching her face carefully for any sign of the discomfort he half expected, the particular awkwardness of confronting a predecessor, even one who existed now only in memory and photographs. Instead, Isabella studied each photograph with genuine tenderness, lingering on the one of Sarah pregnant, smiling at the camera. "She was beautiful," Isabella said quietly, "and she looks so happy here." "She was. We were for a while. I want you to keep these somewhere Mia can see them when she's older. Not hidden away out of some strange sense that they'd hurt me to have around. They're part of her history, part of yours. I don't want to be someone who erases that even accidentally." Caleb looked at her, something in his chest loosening that he hadn't fully realized was still tight. "Most people would find this uncomfortable, looking at photos of the woman I loved before them." "I'm not most people," Isabella said simply. "And I'm not trying to replace her, Caleb. I never wanted to be a replacement for anyone. I just want to be someone who gets to love you and Mia in whatever space is actually available, not some fantasy where Sarah never existed. She's part of why you're the man I fell in love with. I'm not threatened by that. I'm grateful for it." That night, they framed one of the photographs, Sarah laughing at the barbecue, unguarded and young, and hung it in the hallway near Mia's room, alongside a new photograph Caleb had taken recently. Mia and Isabella on the living room floor, surrounded by dinosaurs, both of them laughing at something lost to the moment itself. Mia noticed the new addition the next morning, studying both photographs with her characteristic seriousness before looking up at her father. "That's Mommy," she said, pointing at the older photograph, then shifting her finger to the newer one. "And that's Isabella. Can they both be on my wall?" "They can both be on your wall." Caleb said, crouching down beside her. "Forever if you want." "Good," Mia said, satisfied, already moving on to whatever new adventure awaited her that morning, entirely unburdened by the complicated adult calculus that had taken her father and Isabella months to work through on their own. For Mia, it had never actually been complicated at all. She had simply made room the way she always did for everyone she loved all at once, without asking permission from anyone's fear. That evening, as Caleb watched Isabella help Mia with her nightly ritual of choosing exactly the right stuffed animals to guard her bed, he found himself thinking about how far they'd traveled since a crooked collar and a nervous confession on an ocean terrace through board meetings and stolen photographs. Through 4 days of frightened silence and a mother's careful interrogation over expensive wine through grief, transformed slowly into something that no longer competed with joy, but existed peacefully alongside it. He didn't know yet what the next chapter of this life would ask of them, what other tests waited in the months and years ahead. But watching Isabella tuck his daughter in, with the same careful attention she brought to billion-dollar negotiations, he understood with a certainty that settled deep and permanent in his chest, that whatever came next, they would face it the way they'd faced everything so far together, honestly, without pretending the hard parts didn't exist. Spring came slowly to San Diego, the way it always did, more a shift in light than a change in temperature, but Caleb noticed it that year, in a way he hadn't. In the 4 years since Sarah died, noticed the jacaranda trees blooming purple along the Marina Road. Noticed the particular quality of morning air when he opened the front door with Mia already dressed and impatient beside him. Noticed most of all that he'd stopped bracing himself against happiness the way he used to, waiting for it to be taken away again. Isabella had moved her primary office to San Diego 2 months earlier, a decision that had required restructuring half of Vance Dynamics' executive team and enduring another round of skeptical murmuring from a board that had finally mostly learned to stop questioning her judgment. She still flew to New York twice a month, still ran board meetings with the same precision that had built her empire. But she came home most nights now to the same small house with the mismatched plates and the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. And something about the contrast no longer felt like contradiction. It felt simply like a life she'd built on her own terms finally. "Are you nervous?" Isabella asked, adjusting his tie in the mirror of their bedroom. A habit that had become a private joke between them. One she indulged every time they dressed for something formal, always finding some infinitesimal flaw to correct. "Should I be? It's just dinner with Danny and his wife." "It's not just dinner, Caleb. You've been rehearsing something in the garage for 2 weeks. I found the little velvet box in your toolbox last Tuesday hidden under a torque wrench, which is either the least romantic hiding place in human history or exactly right for you. I haven't decided which." Caleb froze, caught, and then laughed, despite himself. "You weren't supposed to see that. Boy. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for a screwdriver to fix Mia's dollhouse, and I found your entire plan instead." She turned him gently by the shoulders so he faced her fully, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it, all the careful CEO composure entirely absent. "For what it's worth, I've had my answer ready for months. You could have asked me on the terrace that first night, and I still would have said yes, even though it would have been reckless and completely unlike me. I wanted to wait until I was sure," Caleb said. "Not sure about you. I was sure about you almost immediately. Sure about myself. Sure I wasn't asking you to be part of my life because I was scared of being alone, or because Mia loved you, or because it was easier than staying guarded. I wanted to ask you because I chose it clearly with open eyes, knowing exactly how much there was still to risk. And now you're sure. Now I'm sure. He didn't do it that night." In the end, some private instinct told him the moment needed to belong entirely to the two of them, not borrowed from a dinner with friends, however dear those friends had become. Instead, 3 days later, he brought Isabella and Mia both down to the same stretch of coastline where the wedding had taken place nearly a year earlier. The same venue, the same terrace arranged quietly through Danny's connections with the property owner. The string lights hung again just for the evening, empty of the 200 guests who'd filled it the first time. Isabella recognized it the moment they arrived, her hand tightening in his. "Caleb." I wanted to come back, he said, to the place where you fixed my collar and lied about why. I told you it really was crooked. You lied about the reason, he said again, smiling, and we both knew it. I've thought about that moment almost every day since. The moment everything started, even though neither of us was brave enough to admit it yet. Mia, holding Isabella's other hand, looked between the two adults with the particular impatience of a 4-year-old, now closer to 5, who sensed something significant happening and wanted it explained immediately. Why are we here? She asked. This isn't Danny's wedding anymore. No. Caleb agreed, crouching down to her level, taking both her small hands in his. Mia, I need to ask you something important, and I need your honest opinion, because your opinion matters more to me than almost anyone else's in the whole world. Mia's eyes widened, sensing the gravity, even if she didn't fully understand its shape yet. Okay, I want to ask Isabella to marry me, to be part of our family forever, not just visiting it. I wanted to ask you first, because you've been braver about this than either of us grown-ups from the very first day with the dinosaurs. What do you think? Should I ask her? Mia turned to look at Isabella, studying her with the same serious, assessing expression from their very first meeting, before her face broke into the widest smile Caleb had ever seen on her. Yes, she said with complete, unhesitating certainty. Obviously, yes. She already fixed the peace treaty. She already knows how to be in our family. Caleb stood, turning to Isabella, whose eyes had already filled with tears. She wasn't bothering to hide the composed CEO, entirely gone, now replaced by a woman standing on the same terrace where she'd once confessed to touching a stranger's collar just to feel close to him. He reached into his jacket pocket and knelt down on the same stone terrace where they'd first kissed, the ocean breathing steadily below them exactly as it had that first night, indifferent to the enormity of what was happening above it, exactly as it always had been and always would be. Isabella Vance, he said, you walked into my life the same week I'd convinced myself I didn't have room in it for anything except grief and responsibility. You fixed my collar and told me a small lie about why, and somehow that lie was more honest than almost anything anyone else had said to me in 4 years. You've loved my daughter without trying to replace anyone. You've fought for us against a boardroom full of people who wanted to use our love as a weapon, and you won, and then you came home and got down on the floor to negotiate peace treaties between plastic dinosaurs like it was the most important meeting of your week. You taught me that grief and joy don't have to compete, that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let themselves be seen fully by someone who isn't asking for anything except the truth. He opened the box, the ring catching the last light of evening, the same way the wedding lights had caught the water almost a year earlier. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life being the person who fixes your collar when you're too tired to notice it's crooked the way you once fixed mine? Isabella was crying openly now, no attempt at composure, no careful management of the moment, just pure, unguarded joy breaking across her face. Yes, she said, then again louder, laughing through the tears. Yes, Caleb. Absolutely, completely, without any hesitation at all, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and Mia threw herself into both of their arms at once, giggling delighted, entirely unsurprised. Because as far as she was concerned, this had already been decided months ago, over a stegosaurus with a chewed spike in a living room, 3,000 miles from any boardroom, where the only diplomacy that mattered was the kind practiced honestly without agenda by people who had decided to love each other fully. They stood together on that terrace as the sky darkened fully into night, the same ocean rolling in and out below them, indifferent and eternal, the same string lights glowing warm against the encroaching dark. And Caleb thought about everything that had brought them here. The wedding, where he'd tried to stay invisible, the touch that had undone years of careful isolation, the boardroom battles and stolen photographs, and 4 days of frightened silence. The slow, deliberate work of building trust between two people who had each spent years convincing themselves that safety meant staying alone. None of it had been easy. None of it had happened quickly. But all of it had been worth it, every difficult conversation and every risk taken, because it had led finally to this, A family built not out of desperation or convenience, but out of choice, made again and again by two people brave enough to keep choosing each other, even when fear offered them every reason not to. They married 6 months later, in a small ceremony on that same stretch of coastline, Mia serving as flower girl with a dinosaur tucked into her flower basket that she refused to leave behind. Eleanor Vance crying more openly than anyone expected. Danny serving as best man with the particular satisfaction of a man who had witnessed the entire story unfold from its very first accidental collision. Gerald Ashford was notably not invited. Though Isabella had heard through industry channels that his new venture had already begun struggling, without the credibility her company's name had once lent his ambitions a small, quiet justice that she allowed herself to enjoy without guilt. And on the night of their wedding, standing once more on that same terrace where everything had begun, Caleb reached over and gently, unnecessarily straightened his wife's already perfect collar, just to feel the old electricity of that first touch. One more time, and Isabella laughed, understanding exactly what he was doing, exactly why he was doing it, and pulled him close instead of pretending otherwise. Some love stories begin with grand declarations with certainty and fireworks from the very first moment. Theirs had begun instead with a crooked collar, a small lie about why it mattered, and two frightened, guarded people willing to risk everything they'd built to protect themselves, simply because something in each of them recognized without fully understanding why that they had finally found someone worth being brave for. It was not the easiest path either of them could have chosen. It was in the end the only one that led them home.